But it is worth appreciating that perhaps one of the reasons we are born fat is because our brain benefits so much from that fat because of our ability to rely on fat as a primary metabolic fuel, and in so doing, creating ketones to fuel the brain. Because the more we're learning about brain metabolism, and here I am coming back to that topic, the more we appreciate that the brain thrives on ketones. Now, in addition to the caloric reserve and the potential to protect ourselves from scarcity with fat and the energy that it stores, is just the fact that fat can provide some degree of protection and insulation. Insulation, particularly as the fat is stored beneath the skin, which we'll get to in a moment, but also a protection as fat is stored within the visceral space, that fat that is stored deeper within the abdominal cavity. It provides a structure or shape to the intestines and even some degree of, indeed, a protection. It's also very much a part of the immune system. Speaking of the visceral fat, that is the fat, again, that's deep within the abdominal cavity. It is richly loaded with lymph nodes. Lymph nodes, of course, being a primary component, or in fact, if I'm being technical, a secondary component of the immune system, where we can take immune-related cells and let them kind of incubate and get primed for action and then go fight an infection. So visceral fat is very much connected to the immune system, and that ends up actually being a blessing and a curse, as we'll get to later. Okay, now let's transition from the evolutionary role and some of the theories of why we are uniquely fat among the mammals on the earth. And then let's move into understanding the different types of fat. Now, there are two different ways of classifying fat tissue, and you've heard these before, I'm sure. One way is where we store it, and then the other way is how that fat behaves. So let's just talk about the actual location because it's the simplest idea. We primarily store fat in two depots, two distinct areas, and that is subcutaneous. That's the fat that's stored right beneath the skin that I just mentioned a moment ago that acts as a bit of an insulation. So we have subcutaneous fat, and then we have visceral fat. Again, both of these are fats I just mentioned. Visceral fat being the fat that is stored deeper within the abdominal cavity. Now, there are some sex differences in genetics that play into this that we'll get to in a moment. But one way of thinking about the differences is if you can pinch and jiggle it, it is subcutaneous fat. And then visceral fat, of course, is fat you cannot see. However, let's imagine, if you will, two men. They are best pals. They do everything together, and they've both gained 50 pounds of pure fat since they graduated from college 30 years ago. Not an uncommon amount of fat gain. They've gained the same amount of body fat again, and then they're the same weight, same height, everything. But you look at them, and one of them has fat that is spilling over his swim trunks. It's just sort of gushing or kind of flowing down his body, hanging on him. The other man, you can pinch and jiggle, and boy, does it jiggle. The other guy has a big protruding belly, and it does not jiggle. You smack it, and it is hard. Which one of those two fellas do you think has more subcutaneous fat, or in other words, fat that is stored beneath the skin? And which one do you think has more visceral fat, fat stored within the abdominal cavity? Yeah, of course, the subcutaneous fat is the former, the one whose fat is pinchable and jiggable and spilling down over the sides of his swim trunks. And the other fellow, who looks like he's carrying a baby, is in fact just carrying a lot of visceral fat. And that visceral fat is accumulating beneath the muscles of his abdomen. And so when you smack it, it is hard because you're smacking his skin and muscle, and then the fat is beneath that.